The bride stood alone on the platform of the train station in Prescott, Arizona, her white cotton dress wilting in the August heat of 1882, watching as the last passenger collected their belongings and disappeared into the dusty streets, leaving her with nothing but a worn carpetbag and the crushing realization that the man who had promised to marry her was never coming. Victoria Owens had traveled all the way from Boston, answering an advertisement from a Mr. Harold Pritchard who had written such beautiful letters about his ranch, his prospects, and his desire for a refined wife to share his life in the Arizona Territory. She had sold everything she owned to afford the train ticket, said goodbye to the only family she had left, her aging aunt who could no longer afford to keep her, and stepped onto that westbound train with hope blooming in her chest like a spring flower. Now, that hope lay trampled in the dust at her feet. The station master, a kindly older gentleman with wire spectacles and sympathetic eyes, approached her carefully. "Miss, I hate to say it, but we are closing up for the evening. Is there someone I can fetch for you? Family, perhaps?" "I'm supposed to be meeting my intended," Victoria said, her voice barely above a whisper. She hated how it trembled, how her hands shook as they clutched the handle of her bag. "Mr. Harold Pritchard, he should have been here hours ago." The station master's expression shifted, and Victoria felt her stomach drop even further. "Pritchard, you say?" "Miss, I'm afraid I have some unfortunate news. Harold Pritchard passed on near about 3 weeks ago, thrown from a horse, broke his neck. It was in all the local papers." The world tilted sideways. Victoria felt her knees buckle, and she reached out to steady herself against the wooden post of the platform. 3 weeks? But I received his last letter only a month ago. He never mentioned illness or danger. "It was sudden, miss, real sudden. I'm sorry you came all this way for nothing." He shifted his weight uncomfortably. "Do you have funds to return home?" Victoria thought of the $3.20 in her reticule, all that remained of her life savings after paying for the cross-country journey. It would not even buy her a meal for more than a few days, let alone passage back to Boston. And even if it could, what would she return to? Her aunt's boarding house where she had been nothing but an extra mouth to feed, a burden tolerated out of obligation? At 22 years old, she had exhausted all her prospects in Boston. There had been no suitors, no opportunities, nothing but a lifetime of genteel poverty stretching ahead of her like an endless desert. "No," she admitted quietly, "I have nowhere to go." The station master pulled at his collar, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. "There is a boarding house down on Montezuma Street. Mrs. Fletcher runs a decent establishment. She could give you a room on credit until you figure out your situation." Victoria nodded numbly, though she had no idea how she would pay for even one night's lodging. She picked up her carpetbag and descended the platform steps, her legs moving automatically while her mind raced through impossible calculations. Perhaps she could find work as a seamstress or a teacher, though she knew positions were scarce and competition fierce. Perhaps she could appeal to the charity of the local church, though the thought made her cheeks burn with shame. The sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold that might have been beautiful under different circumstances. Prescott spread out before her, a frontier town nestled in the high country of the Arizona Territory, surrounded by pine-covered mountains and rocky hills. The streets were wide and dusty, lined with wooden buildings that looked hastily constructed, but sturdy enough. Men on horseback rode past, their eyes lingering on her with curiosity, and something else that made her pull her shawl tighter around her shoulders despite the heat. She found the boarding house easily enough, a 2-story structure painted white with a small garden struggling to survive in the dry soil out front. Mrs. Fletcher answered her knock, a plump woman with graying hair and sharp eyes that assessed Victoria in a single glance. "I need a room," Victoria said before her courage could fail her. "The station master sent me. I can pay you in 3 days once I find employment." Mrs. Fletcher's expression was skeptical. "This is not a charity, miss. I run a business here." "I understand, but I am a hard worker, and I can sew, cook, clean, teach children their letters. Surely someone in town needs help. I just need a place to stay until I can establish myself." Victoria hated the desperation in her voice, but she had no choice but to lay bare her situation. Something in Mrs. Fletcher's face softened slightly. "You are that mail-order bride who came for Harold Pritchard, are you not? Word travels fast in a small town. I heard the afternoon train brought a young woman in a white dress. Victoria felt tears prick her eyes, but refused to let them fall. Yes, madam. I did not know he had passed. I came all the way from Boston. See, Fletcher sighed heavily, then stepped back to allow Victoria entry. 3 days. You can have the small room under the stairs, and you will earn your keep by helping with laundry and meal preparation. But if you have not found a way to pay by Sunday, you will have to move on. I cannot afford to feed extra mouths. Thank you, Victoria breathed, relief flooding through her. Thank you so much. The room was barely larger than a closet, with a narrow bed, a small table, and a hook on the wall for hanging clothes. But it was clean and private, and Victoria sank onto the thin mattress with gratitude. She allowed herself exactly 5 minutes to feel the full weight of her situation, to acknowledge the fear and uncertainty that threatened to overwhelm her. Then, she washed her face in the basin of water Mrs. Fletcher had provided, changed out of her wilted white dress into a simple brown calico, and went downstairs to begin earning her temporary shelter. The next morning, Victoria rose before dawn and helped Mrs. Fletcher prepare breakfast for the other boarders, 6 men who worked various jobs in town and ate their meals in near silence before heading out for the day. Afterward, she walked through Prescott's main street, stopping at every shop, every business, every place that might possibly need help. The responses were all the same. Times were hard. They had no money for extra workers. Perhaps try somewhere else. By noon, Victoria had exhausted every obvious possibility. She stood on the corner of Montezuma and Gurley Streets, watching the townspeople go about their business, and tried to think of what to do next. A few women passed her with sympathetic glances, clearly aware of her story. A few men looked at her with interest that made her skin crawl, and she quickly moved on before they could approach. It was the sound of children's laughter that drew her attention. Victoria followed the sound to a small church at the edge of town, where a group of children played in the yard while a young woman in a simple gray dress tried to organize them into some semblance of order. Victoria approached carefully, not wanting to intrude. "Excuse me," she called out. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I'm looking for work. I noticed you have your hands full, and I have experience teaching children. Might you need an assistant?" The young woman looked up, her face flushed with exertion. "Oh, I wish I could say yes. I'm just a volunteer myself. The town cannot afford to pay for a proper school, so the church lets us use this space. Most of the children cannot pay anything, and those who can only manage a few pennies a month." Victoria's shoulders sagged with disappointment, but she forced a smile. "I understand. Thank you anyway." She turned to leave, but the young woman called after her. "Wait. You are the bride who came for Harold Pritchard, are you not? I heard about what happened. That must have been terrible for you." "News does travel quickly here," Victoria said with a slight smile. "I am Sarah Mitchell. My husband runs the general store." She hesitated, then continued. "I do not suppose you know anything about tending bar. The saloon on Whiskey Row just lost their serving girl. She ran off with a traveling salesman last week. The owner, Mr. Daniels, has been looking for someone respectable to replace her. It is not the most refined work, but it pays decent." Victoria felt her face flush. A saloon was hardly the kind of establishment a respectable woman would work in, but she was in no position to be particular. "I've never worked in a saloon, but I'm a quick learner. Thank you for the suggestion." She found Whiskey Row easily enough, a street lined with saloons, gambling halls, and other establishments that catered to the miners, cowboys, and drifters who flowed through Prescott. The Palace Saloon was one of the larger buildings, with a false front painted in garish colors and the sound of piano music drifting through the swinging doors. Victoria stood outside for a full minute, gathering her courage. Then she pushed through the doors and stepped into the dim interior. The smell of tobacco smoke, whiskey, and unwashed bodies hit her immediately, and she had to suppress the urge to turn and flee. Several men looked up from their card games and drinks, their eyes tracking her movement as she approached the bar. The bartender, a heavy-set man with a thick mustache, raised an eyebrow. "Miss, this is not really the place for a lady like yourself." "Are you Mr. Daniels?" Victoria asked, forcing her voice to remain steady. "I am." "I heard you need someone to serve drinks. I'm looking for work." Mr. Daniels studied her carefully, taking in her neat appearance and the determined set of her jaw. You know what kind of establishment this is? The men who come here can be rough. They drink too much, say things they should not. It is not easy work. I need employment, Mr. Daniels. I am a fast learner, and I am not afraid of hard work. I will keep your customers happy and your establishment respectable. He seemed to consider this, then nodded slowly. I will give you a trial. $3 a week plus tips, and you work 6 days with Sundays off. You serve drinks, you keep the tables clean, and you do not engage in any other activities with the customers, if you understand my meaning. I run a saloon, not a brothel, and I expect my employees to maintain proper behavior. I understand completely, Victoria said, relief washing over her. $3 a week would be enough to pay Mrs. Fletcher for her room and have a little left over for food and necessities. It was not much, but it was survival. You can start tomorrow evening. Be here at 6 o'clock sharp and wear something practical. That fancy dress will not last a day in here. Victoria spent her remaining money on a simple black skirt and white shirtwaist from the general store, the kind of outfit that would be appropriate for her new work. That evening, she helped Mrs. Fletcher with the dinner service and laundry, exhaustion pulling at her bones, but determination keeping her upright. She had found a way to survive, at least for now. It was not the life she had imagined when she boarded that westbound train, but it was better than starving on the streets. Her first night at the Palace Saloon was overwhelming. The noise, the smell, the constant demands from customers who ranged from polite to crude. Victoria learned quickly to dodge grabbing hands, to deflect inappropriate comments with a firm but pleasant response, and to keep moving so she was never cornered. Mr. Daniels watched her carefully that first night, and by the end of her shift, he gave her an approving nod. You did well, Miss Owens. Come back tomorrow. The days began to blur together into a routine. Victoria worked 6 nights a week at the saloon, enduring the leers and comments of drunk men who seemed to view her as entertainment rather than a person. During the day, she slept, helped Mrs. Fletcher with chores, and tried to ignore the crushing loneliness that pressed down on her whenever she had a quiet moment to think. This was not the life she had dreamed of, but it was the life she had, and she would make the best of it. 3 weeks passed in this manner. Victoria learned the rhythms of the saloon, learned which customers to avoid, and which ones were actually decent men who treated her with respect. She learned to count her tips carefully and hide the money in her room, building a small reserve that gave her a tiny measure of security. She made a few acquaintances among the other women in town, though most kept their distance from someone who worked in a saloon. It was a Friday evening in late September when everything changed. Victoria was carrying a tray of whiskey glasses to a table of cowboys when the saloon doors swung open with more force than usual. Every head turned toward the entrance, and the noise level dropped noticeably as a man stepped inside. He was massive, easily over 6 feet tall, with shoulders so broad they nearly filled the doorway. His hair was dark brown and longer than was fashionable, touching his collar in waves that suggested he cut it himself with a knife when it got too long. His face was weathered and tanned from years in the sun, with a strong jaw shadowed by several days' worth of beard, and eyes the color of steel that swept the room with careful assessment. He wore buckskin pants and a heavy wool shirt, despite the warmth of the evening, and the rifle slung across his back spoke of someone who lived far from the comforts of civilization. A mountain man. Victoria had heard stories of such men, trappers and hunters who lived alone in the high country, coming to town only when they needed supplies or had furs to trade. She had never actually seen one before, and she found herself staring along with everyone else. The man's eyes found her across the room, and for a moment their gazes locked. Victoria felt a strange jolt run through her, something she could not name but that made her breath catch in her throat. Then the moment passed, and the man moved toward the bar with the easy confidence of someone who knew exactly how dangerous he was and had no need to prove it. "Whiskey," he said to Mr. Daniels, his voice a deep rumble that carried despite the returning noise of the saloon. "And information. I'm looking for a man named Harold Pritchard." Victoria nearly dropped her tray. She set it down on the nearest table with shaking hands and moved closer, desperate to hear what the stranger wanted with her deceased intended. Mr. Daniels poured the whiskey and slid the glass across the bar. "Pritchard is dead. Died about 6 weeks ago now. Horse threw him and broke his neck." The mountain man's expression did not change, but something flickered in those steel gray eyes. Dead. You are certain? Buried him myself. Why are you looking for him? He owed me a debt I came to collect. The man tossed back the whiskey in one smooth motion and set the glass down with a soft click. He have any family? Anyone who might know about his affairs? No family that I know of. He kept to himself mostly. Ran a small ranch about 10 miles out of town. I suppose everything he owned went to the bank when he died, seeing as he had no heirs. The mountain man stood silent for a moment, his jaw working as if chewing over this information. Then he glanced around the saloon again, and his eyes once more found Victoria. This time, he held her gaze deliberately, and Victoria felt that strange sensation again, like lightning dancing across her skin. That woman there, he said, still looking at Victoria. She's been staring at me since I mentioned Pritchard's name. She knows something about him? Every eye in the saloon turned to Victoria. She felt her face flush hot, but she lifted her chin and walked forward, refusing to be intimidated. I am Victoria Owens. I was supposed to marry Harold Pritchard. I came all the way from Boston to be his bride, only to discover he had died before I arrived. The mountain man studied her with an intensity that made her want to squirm, but she held her ground. Up close, he was even more imposing, all hard muscle and coiled strength. His hands were large and scarred, the hands of someone who worked with them every day in harsh conditions. But there was intelligence in his eyes, and something else she could not quite identify. You came to marry a man you had never met? He asked, and there was no judgment in his tone, only curiosity. I answered his advertisement. We corresponded for several months. It seemed like a reasonable arrangement. Victoria heard the defensive note in her voice and hated it. I suppose you find that foolish. I find it brave, he said quietly, and the unexpected compliment caught her off guard. It takes courage to travel across a country to start a new life with a stranger. They stood there for a moment, the noise of the saloon fading into the background. Victoria was acutely aware of how large he was, how he seemed to occupy space in a way that made everything else feel smaller. She was also aware of how he was looking at her, not with the crude speculation of the drunk cowboys, but with genuine interest. What was your debt with Pritchard? She heard herself ask. The mountain man's expression hardened slightly. He bought supplies from me last spring, furs and meat for his ranch. Said he would pay me when he sold his cattle in the fall. $500 he owed me. I came down from my camp in the mountains to collect. $500. Victoria could barely imagine such a sum. It was more money than she would make in 2 years working at the saloon. I am sorry, she said, meaning it. I do not know anything about his financial affairs. As Mr. Daniels said, everything probably went to the bank. Banks do not honor debts to men like me, the mountain man said with a slight twist of his mouth that was not quite a smile. Men who live outside of civilization do not get the same justice as respectable folks. That does not seem fair. Fair has nothing to do with it. That is just how the world works. He signaled to Mr. Daniels for another whiskey, then turned back to Victoria. So you came all this way to marry Pritchard, and now you are working in a saloon. Life has not been kind to you, Miss Owens. I do what I must to survive, Victoria said, lifting her chin again. There is no shame in honest work. I never said there was. He accepted the second whiskey from Mr. Daniels and studied the amber liquid thoughtfully. Pritchard was a fool. If I had a woman like you willing to travel across the country to be my wife, I would have made sure I was alive to greet her at the station. The words, delivered in that deep matter-of-fact tone, made something flutter in Victoria's chest. Before she could formulate a response, one of the cowboys at the corner table shouted for more drinks, and she had to return to her work. But she remained acutely aware of the mountain man at the bar, nursing his whiskey and watching the room with those careful, assessing eyes. He stayed for 2 hours, speaking occasionally with Mr. Daniels or one of the other patrons, but mostly just sitting quietly and watching. Victoria caught him looking at her several times, and each time their eyes met, she felt that same inexplicable pull. It was unsettling and exciting in equal measure. Finally, as the evening grew late, the mountain man stood and made his way toward the door. He paused next to Victoria as she was clearing a table, and she looked up at him, surprised. What is your name? She asked impulsively. I told you mine, but you never said yours. Dalton Owens, he said, and something shifted in his expression. Interesting coincidence. us sharing a last name. Owens is not an uncommon name, Victoria said, though her heart had started beating faster at the coincidence. No, it is not. He studied her for another long moment, then touched the brim of his hat in a gesture that was oddly courteous coming from such a rough man. Good night, Miss Victoria Owens. I hope life starts being kinder to you. Then he was gone, disappearing into the night, and Victoria was left with a strange sense of loss she did not understand. She had spoken to the man for all of 5 minutes, and yet his absence felt like something important had been taken away. She thought about him that night as she lay in her small room at the boarding house, listening to the sounds of Prescott settling down for sleep. She thought about his steel-gray eyes and the way he had called her brave. She thought about the $500 he would never recover and the life he lived alone in the mountains. She fell asleep with his name on her lips. Dalton Owens. The next morning, Victoria was surprised to find Dalton sitting on the front steps of the boarding house when she came down for breakfast. He stood as she emerged, his large frame unfolding with easy grace. "Mr. Owens," she said, unable to keep the surprise from her voice. "What are you doing here?" "Waiting for you," he said simply. "I did some thinking last night. I have a proposition for you if you will hear me out." Victoria glanced around, aware that they were attracting attention from passers-by. "Perhaps we should speak somewhere more private. There's a bench by the church down the street. We can talk there." They walked in silence, Victoria acutely aware of the curious stares following them. Dalton seemed oblivious to the attention, his long strides eating up the distance in a way that forced her to hurry to keep pace. When they reached the bench, he waited for her to sit before settling beside her, his large frame making the wooden seat seem small. "I came to town to collect a debt that can never be repaid," Dalton began without preamble. "That money was supposed to fund my trapping operation through the winter. Without it, I will have a hard time getting the supplies I need." "I am truly sorry," Victoria said, not knowing what else to offer. "Let me finish," he said, not unkindly. "I was angry when I rode into Prescott yesterday. Angry at Pritchard for dying before paying me. Angry at the world for being unfair. Angry at myself for trusting a man's word without getting it in writing. But then I saw you in that saloon, and I learned your story, and I realized something." He turned to look at her directly, and the intensity in his eyes made her breath catch. "You lost everything because of Pritchard's death, too. Maybe even more than I did. You traveled 2,000 miles to build a life with a man who promised to take care of you, and instead, you ended up alone in a town where you know no one, working in a place where men treat you like property. That does not sit right with me." "It is not your problem to solve," Victoria said quietly, though something in her chest had started to glow warm at his words. "Maybe not. But I spent all night thinking about what you said, about doing what you must to survive. I know something about that. I have been surviving alone for a long time, Miss Owens, and it struck me that maybe both our problems could solve each other." Victoria frowned, not understanding. "What do you mean?" Dalton took a deep breath, and for the first time, she saw uncertainty flicker across his features. "I live in the mountains about 200 miles north of here. I have a cabin, a good trap line, enough land to support a small ranch if I ever decided to settle down properly. It is a hard life, but it is a good one. I provide for myself, and I have never wanted for much." He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. "But it is a lonely life, Miss Owens. I go months without seeing another soul. And lately, that loneliness has been eating at me more than it used to. I am 34 years old, and I have spent the last 12 years living like a hermit. Maybe it is time I considered a different path." Victoria's heart had started to pound, though she was not sure why. "What are you saying, Mr. Owens?" "I'm saying that you came to Prescott to marry a man you had never met because you needed security in a new life. I am saying that I need a wife, someone to share my life and help me build something more than just survival. I'm saying that maybe, if you are willing, we could help each other." The words hung in the air between them, impossible and absurd, and yet somehow making a strange kind of sense. Victoria stared at him, trying to process what he was proposing. "You want to marry me?" she finally managed. "You do not even know me. You did not know Pritchard either, but you were willing to marry him. I am offering the same arrangement, except I am here, alive and able to actually provide what I am promising. He held her gaze steadily. I will not lie to you, Miss Owens. My life is hard. The cabin is small and basic. The winters are harsh and we would be isolated for months at a time. But you would be safe, fed, and cared for. You would be my wife in truth, with all the respect and protection that brings. And maybe, if we are lucky, we might even find something more than just convenience in the arrangement. Victoria's mind raced. It was insane. She had known this man for less than 24 hours. He was practically a stranger, a rough mountain man who lived in the wilderness like a wild animal. And yet, what was the alternative? Continue working at the saloon, enduring the groping hands and crude comments, living in a tiny room with no future beyond barely scraping by? At least Dalton was offering her something real, something that could be a genuine life. Wow, why me? She asked. You could probably find a woman in Prescott who knows this country, who is already adapted to frontier life. Because you are brave enough to travel across a country for a chance at a better life. Because you did not fall apart when that life was snatched away from you. Because you lift your chin and work hard instead of giving up. He shifted slightly, his expression serious. And because when I looked at you last night, I felt something I have not felt in a very long time. Interest, curiosity, a pull toward another person. I figure that is as good a foundation to build on as any. Victoria felt her cheeks flush at his honesty. I felt something too, she admitted quietly. When you walked into the saloon, it was like lightning. Then maybe we owe it to ourselves to see where that lightning leads, Dalton said. His rough, scarred hand reached out and gently took hers, engulfing it in warmth and calluses. I am not a refined man, Miss Owens. I do not have fancy manners or education. But I am honest, I am strong, and I will protect you with my life. That is what I can offer you. The question is, are you brave enough to take another chance? Victoria looked down at their joined hands, at the contrast between his massive weathered hand and her smaller, paler one. She thought about the life stretching ahead of her in Prescott, lonely and hard and going nowhere. She thought about the alternative Dalton was offering, equally hard but with the possibility of something more, something real. Yes, she heard herself say. Yes, I will marry you. Dalton's face transformed with a smile, and Victoria realized it was the first time she had seen him truly smile. It softened his harsh features, made him look younger and less intimidating. You will not regret this, he said with quiet conviction. I will make sure of it. When? Victoria asked, suddenly nervous about the enormity of what she had just agreed to. Today, right now if possible. I need to head back to my camp soon before the weather turns. We can find a preacher, make it legal, and leave tomorrow morning. Tomorrow? Victoria felt panic rising. But I need time to prepare, to gather supplies, to say goodbye. Goodbye to who? Dalton asked gently. You said yourself you know no one here, and I have supplies waiting at the general store, everything you will need for the journey and for the winter. Trust me, Miss Owens, I have done this before. I know what is required. He was right, of course. She had no one to say goodbye to, nothing to prepare. Her entire life fit into a single carpet bag, and yet the speed of it all made her head spin. Dalton seemed to sense her panic because his grip on her hand tightened reassuringly. I know this is fast. I know you are scared. But sometimes the best decisions are the ones we make with our hearts instead of our heads. Your head would tell you to stay here, to keep working and scraping by in safety. But your heart brought you to the frontier in the first place. Listen to it now. Victoria took a deep breath and nodded. All right, today. Let us find a preacher. The ceremony was brief and practical, performed by an elderly minister in the small church where Victoria had first inquired about work. Dalton had purchased a simple gold band from the general store, and it slid onto her finger with surprising ease, as if it had been made for her. There were no witnesses besides the minister's wife, no flowers or music or any of the traditional trappings of a wedding. But when Dalton spoke his vows in that deep, steady voice, promising to honor and protect her for the rest of their lives, Victoria felt tears prick her eyes. I, Victoria Owens, take you, Dalton Owens, to be my lawfully wedded husband, she said, her voice surprisingly strong. I promise to be a faithful and true wife, to stand by your side in hardship and in joy, for as long as we both shall live." "You may kiss your bride," the minister said with a kind smile. Dalton leaned down, his large hands gentle as they framed her face. His kiss was soft and brief, almost chaste, but Victoria felt warmth spread through her entire body at the contact. When he pulled back, his steel-gray eyes were soft with something that might have been tenderness. "My wife," he said quietly, as if testing the words. "My husband," Victoria replied, and felt the truth of it settle into her bones. They spent their wedding night in Dalton's room at a modest hotel, the only concession to tradition he allowed. Victoria expected him to claim his marital rights immediately, but instead he built up the fire, helped her settle into the single chair, and sat down on the bed with careful distance between them. "I know this is not the wedding night you probably imagined," he said. "I know this whole situation is strange and rushed, so I want you to know that I will not force anything on you. We are legally married, and that is important for your protection and for the eyes of society. But the other aspects of marriage, the intimate parts, those can wait until you are ready, until we know each other better." Victoria felt a rush of gratitude and affection for this rough man who was showing her more consideration than many refined gentlemen would have. "Thank you," she said softly. "That means a great deal to me." "You are my wife now," Dalton said simply. "That means your comfort and happiness matter to me. We have time to build something real between us. There is no need to rush." They talked late into the night, sharing stories of their pasts. Victoria learned that Dalton had grown up on a farm in Missouri, the youngest of 6 children. When he was 22, both his parents had died of fever, and the farm had gone to his oldest brother. Dalton had headed west, looking for a new life, and had found it in the mountains of the Arizona Territory. He had spent 12 years trapping and hunting, building his cabin and his skills, living a solitary existence that had suited him until recently. "What changed?" Victoria asked. "Why did you suddenly want a wife after all these years?" Dalton was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. "I think it was last winter," he finally said. "I got snowed in for 3 months, could not leave my cabin at all, and somewhere during those long, dark nights, I realized that surviving was not the same as living. I was existing, but I was not building anything, not creating anything that would last beyond me. I wanted more than that. I wanted someone to share it with." "I understand," Victoria said. "I felt the same way in Boston. I was living in my aunt's boarding house, helping her with the work, but always feeling like a guest, never truly belonging anywhere. When I saw Mr. Pritchard's advertisement, it was the first time I had felt hope in years, the hope of building something of my own, of mattering to someone." "You matter to me," Dalton said, looking at her with such intensity that she felt her breath catch. "I know we just met. I know this is all strange and new. But I meant what I said in my vows, Victoria. You are my wife, and I will spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret taking this chance with me." That night, Victoria slept in the bed while Dalton took the floor, his large frame wrapped in a blanket beside the fire. It should have been awkward, this intimacy with a stranger, but somehow it felt right. Safe. Like maybe, against all odds, she had made the right choice. They left Prescott at dawn the next morning. Dalton's supplies loaded onto 2 sturdy pack horses, while Victoria rode a gentle mare he had purchased specifically for her. She wore the practical traveling clothes he had bought, including a pair of split riding skirts that would have scandalized Boston society, but were infinitely more practical for wilderness travel. The journey north was unlike anything Victoria had experienced. They followed rough trails through pine forests and across rocky terrain, climbing higher into the mountains with each passing day. Dalton proved to be a patient teacher, showing her how to make camp, how to start a fire without matches, how to read the signs of weather in the clouds and the behavior of animals. He was attentive without being overbearing, always checking that she was comfortable, that she had enough food and water, that the pace was not too demanding. At night, they slept in separate bedrolls around the campfire, maintaining a respectful distance while still feeling the growing connection between them. They talked for hours, sharing more stories, more pieces of themselves. Victoria told him about growing up in Boston, about losing her parents to cholera when she was 15, about the years of feeling like she was drifting without purpose or direction. Dalton told her about the mountains, about the beauty and the danger, about the sense of peace he found in the wilderness. "Are you not lonely?" Victoria asked one night as they sat watching the stars wheel overhead. "Living so far from civilization?" "I was," Dalton admitted, "but I think loneliness and solitude are different things. I chose solitude because it was better than being around people who did not understand me, who wanted me to be something I was not. But loneliness crept in anyway, because humans are not meant to be completely alone." "And now?" Victoria asked softly. "Now I'm not alone," Dalton said, turning to look at her. The firelight played across his strong features, making him look almost mythical. "Now I have you, and everything is different." They were 5 days into their journey when the first real test came. Dark clouds had been building all afternoon, and Dalton had been pushing them hard to reach a cave he knew of, a place where they could shelter from what was clearly going to be a significant storm. They made it just as the first fat raindrops began to fall, leading the horses into the shallow cave and quickly unloading their gear. The storm broke with fury, rain sheeting down so hard that visibility beyond the cave mouth dropped to nearly nothing. Lightning cracked across the sky, followed by thunder that echoed through the mountains like artillery. Victoria pressed back against the cave wall, trying not to show how frightened she was. Dalton had the fire going quickly, the smoke drawn out through a natural chimney in the cave roof. He spread out their bedrolls and unpacked food for a cold supper, working with the easy efficiency of someone who had weathered countless storms in the wilderness. When everything was secure, he settled down beside Victoria, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his large body. "Scared?" he asked quietly. "A little," Victoria admitted. "We do not have storms like this in Boston, at least not where you can feel the full force of them." "They can be frightening," Dalton agreed, "but they are also beautiful in their own way. All that power, all that energy. It reminds you how small you are, but also how strong you can be to survive it." Another crack of lightning illuminated the cave, followed almost immediately by thunder. Victoria flinched involuntarily, and Dalton's arm came around her shoulders, pulling her against his side. She stiffened for a moment, then relaxed into his warmth, letting herself take comfort in his solid presence. "I have you," Dalton murmured. "You are safe with me." They sat like that for hours, watching the storm rage outside their shelter. Gradually, Victoria became aware of other sensations beyond her fear. The strength of Dalton's arm around her, the steady beat of his heart beneath her ear where she had rested her head against his chest, the scent of him, wood smoke and leather and something uniquely masculine, the way his breathing had deepened, as if he was as affected by their closeness as she was. "Dalton?" she said softly. "Yes?" "Thank you for coming to Prescott. Thank you for finding me." She felt him shift, and then his hand was gently tilting her face up toward his. In the flickering firelight, his eyes were dark and intense. "I traveled 200 miles to collect a debt," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Instead, I found something far more valuable. I found you." This time when he kissed her, it was different from the chaste kiss at their wedding. This kiss was deeper, more passionate, speaking of desire and need and the connection building between them. Victoria responded without thinking, her hands coming up to tangle in his long hair, pulling him closer. She felt his arms tighten around her, felt his large body shift to bring her more fully against him. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Dalton rested his forehead against hers. "Victoria," he breathed, "tell me to stop if this is too fast. Tell me if you need more time." Victoria thought about the question, about the expectations of proper courtship and gradual intimacy. Then she thought about how life could change in an instant, how Harold Pritchard had died before she ever met him, how she had found herself alone and desperate in a frontier town. She thought about how Dalton had appeared like an answer to a prayer she had not known she was saying, about how right it felt to be in his arms. "I do not want you to stop," she whispered. "You are my husband, Dalton. I am your wife. And I want this. I want you." What followed was both tender and passionate, Dalton taking care to be gentle despite his size and strength, Victoria discovering a depth of feeling and sensation she had never imagined. The storm raged outside, but inside the cave, they created their own warmth, their own connection. When they finally lay wrapped in each other's arms, Victoria felt a contentment she had never known before. "Are you all right?" Dalton asked, his large hand stroking her hair with surprising gentleness. "Better than all right," Victoria said, pressing a kiss to his chest. "I feel like I finally found what I have been searching for." "What is that?" "Home," Victoria said simply. "You are my home now, Dalton Owens." She felt him shudder, felt his arms tighten around her. "And you are mine," he said roughly. "My wife, my home, my everything." They continued their journey the next morning with a new ease between them, the last barriers of unfamiliarity stripped away. Dalton was more openly affectionate, reaching out to touch her hand as they rode, stealing kisses when they stopped to rest. Victoria found herself laughing more, teasing him, feeling a joy she had not known was possible. It took another 5 days to reach Dalton's cabin, pushing higher and higher into the mountains until they were surrounded by towering pines and rocky peaks. When they finally rounded a bend and Dalton pointed ahead, Victoria caught her breath at the sight. The cabin sat in a small valley, backed up against a sheer cliff face with a stream running nearby. It was larger than she had expected, built from solid logs with a stone chimney and what looked like glass windows, a real luxury in the wilderness. There was a small barn for animals, a smokehouse, and evidence of careful cultivation in the form of a vegetable garden and neatly stacked firewood. "This is your home?" Victoria asked, surprised at how substantial it was. "Our home," Dalton corrected with a smile. "I built it myself over the years. I know it is not fancy, but it is solid and warm. I think you will find it comfortable enough." Comfortable was an understatement. Inside, the cabin was neat and well organized, with a large stone fireplace dominating one wall, a solid table and chairs, and a bed that was clearly built to accommodate Dalton's large frame. There were furs on the floor and the bed, shelves lined with supplies, hooks for hanging clothes and equipment. It was not Boston, but it was cozy and inviting in a way her aunt's boarding house had never been. "It is wonderful," Victoria said sincerely, turning in a slow circle to take it all in. "You built all this yourself?" "Over the years," Dalton said, looking pleased at her reaction. "It gave me something to do during the long winters. I kept adding improvements, making it more comfortable. I guess part of me was always hoping I would eventually find someone to share it with." That evening, they prepared dinner together in the cabin's small kitchen area, working side by side with an ease that felt natural. Dalton proved surprisingly skilled at cooking, and Victoria learned how to prepare the wild game and foraged plants that made up the bulk of their diet. After dinner, they sat together by the fire, Victoria leaning against Dalton's broad chest while he told her about the surrounding area, about the trap lines he ran, about the rhythms of life in the mountains. "Winter will be here soon," he said, his fingers playing absently with her hair. "Once the heavy snows start, we will be stuck here until spring. It can be hard being isolated like that. I want you to be prepared." "I have you," Victoria said, echoing his words from the storm. "As long as we are together, I can handle anything." "I'm going to hold you to that when you are going stir-crazy in February," Dalton teased, but there was warmth in his voice. The weeks that followed were some of the happiest of Victoria's life. She learned the rhythms of mountain living, how to preserve meat and vegetables, how to identify edible plants and avoid dangerous animals, how to shoot a rifle well enough to defend herself if necessary. Dalton was an excellent teacher, patient and thorough, always making sure she understood not just what to do but why. But it was not all work. They went on long walks through the forest, Dalton showing her his favorite places, the hidden waterfall where eagles nested, the meadow where elk grazed in the early morning. They talked endlessly, learning each other's hopes and dreams, fears and insecurities. They made love with increasing passion and tenderness, discovering each other's bodies and hearts in equal measure. Victoria had never been so happy. The life was hard, certainly harder than anything she had experienced in Boston, but it felt real and meaningful in a way her previous existence never had. She was building something with Dalton, creating a home and a life that was truly theirs. The first snow came in late October, a light dusting that melted by noon but signaled the changing season. Dalton increased his efforts to finish preparations for winter, checking and rechecking their supplies, reinforcing the barn, laying in extra firewood. Victoria worked beside him, learning to appreciate the satisfaction of physical labor, of seeing the concrete results of her efforts. One evening in early November, as they sat together after dinner, Victoria realized she had not had her monthly courses in over 6 weeks. She had been so busy, so caught up in learning her new life, that she had not noticed the absence. But now, sitting there with Dalton's hand resting casually on her stomach, she felt a flutter of possibility. "Dalton," she said softly, "I think I might be carrying your child." His hand stilled, and he turned to look at her with wide eyes. "You think you are pregnant?" "I believe so. I cannot be completely certain yet, but all the signs point to it." For a moment, Dalton just stared at her. Then a slow, wondering smile spread across his face, transforming his harsh features into something almost boyish with joy. "A baby," he breathed. "We are going to have a baby." He pulled her into his arms, holding her with a gentleness that belied his enormous strength. Victoria felt tears slide down her cheeks, but they were happy tears, tears of joy and gratitude and wonder at how much her life had changed in just 2 short months. "I love you," Dalton said fiercely, pulling back just enough to look into her eyes. "I know we have not said those words yet. I know this all started as a practical arrangement. But I love you, Victoria. With everything I am, I love you." "I love you too," Victoria said, the words coming easily, feeling right. "I think I started falling in love with you the moment you walked into that saloon. You looked so strong and capable and real, like everything I had been searching for without knowing it." They made love that night with a new intensity, celebrating the life growing inside her, celebrating the love they had found against all odds. Afterward, lying in the darkness with Dalton's hand spread protectively over her still flat stomach, Victoria thought about the journey that had brought her here. She had traveled 2,000 miles to marry a stranger, only to be abandoned. She had worked in a saloon, desperate and alone. And then Dalton had appeared, a mountain man who had traveled 200 miles for a debt and found something far more precious. "What are you thinking?" Dalton asked softly in the darkness. "I am thinking about fate," Victoria said, "about how Harold Pritchard's death, which seemed like the worst thing that could have happened, actually led me to the best thing, to you. If he had lived, I would have married him, and I would never have known what I was missing." "I have thought the same thing," Dalton admitted. "I was so angry when I learned he had died, angry about the money, angry about the injustice. But if he had lived, if he had paid me what he owed, I would have collected my debt and gone back to my mountain. I never would have met you, never would have found this happiness." "So what does that mean?" Victoria asked. "That everything happens for a reason? That fate brought us together?" "I think it means that sometimes the worst things lead to the best things, if we are brave enough to keep going, to keep taking chances." He pressed a kiss to her forehead. "You were brave enough to come west, brave enough to survive when your plans fell apart, brave enough to take a chance on a rough mountain man you barely knew. That bravery gave us this life, this love, this baby. That is better than any fate." Winter set in with a vengeance in late November, heavy snow falling for days at a time until the cabin was surrounded by drifts that reached the windows. But inside, Victoria and Dalton created their own world, warm and intimate and perfect. They spent the long winter days working on small projects, Dalton carving a cradle for the baby, while Victoria sewed tiny clothes from soft deer hide. They read books together, Dalton revealing a surprising love of poetry and literature that he had developed during his solitary years. They cooked elaborate meals, played cards, made love, and talked for hours about everything and nothing. Victoria's belly began to swell with their child, and Dalton treated her like precious glass, constantly fussing over her comfort and health. She both loved and was exasperated by his overprotectiveness, finally sitting him down in February to have a frank discussion about how she was pregnant, not fragile. "I know you are strong," Dalton said, looking sheepish, "but you are carrying my child, Victoria, the most precious thing in the world to me besides you yourself. I cannot help wanting to protect you both." "And I love you for it," Victoria said, taking his large hands in hers. "But you have to trust me to know my own limits. I will not do anything to endanger our baby. But I also cannot spend the next 4 months sitting in a chair doing nothing. I will go mad." They compromised, Victoria continuing to do light work while Dalton handled anything heavy or strenuous. It was a good balance, and it carried them through the rest of the winter into the early spring thaw. The baby came in late May, during a warm spell that had the meadow flowers blooming and birds singing in the trees. Dalton delivered his son with hands that shook with fear and wonder, catching the tiny, squalling infant and wrapping him in soft blankets. Victoria was exhausted but triumphant, holding her son against her breast and feeling a love so fierce it was almost painful. "A boy," Dalton said, his voice thick with emotion. "We have a son, Victoria." "What should we name him?" Victoria asked, looking up at her husband through tear-blurred eyes. "James," Dalton said immediately. "After my father, James Owens." "James Owens," Victoria repeated, testing the name. "It is perfect. He is perfect." That summer was a blur of exhaustion and joy as they adapted to life with an infant. Little James proved to have healthy lungs and an insatiable appetite, keeping them both busy around the clock. But Dalton proved to be a devoted father, walking the floor with his son at night, changing soiled cloths without complaint, entertaining the baby with silly faces and songs while Victoria rested. Watching her massive, rough mountain man husband cradling their tiny son with such infinite gentleness made Victoria fall in love with him all over again. This was the life she had dreamed of without knowing it, this partnership and family and love that filled every corner of their small cabin. When James was 3 months old, Dalton announced that they needed to make a trip to Prescott for supplies and to introduce their son to civilization. Victoria was nervous about the journey with such a young baby, but Dalton had fashioned a clever carrier that allowed her to wear James against her chest, keeping him safe and warm during the long ride. Prescott had grown in the years since Victoria had last seen it, new buildings springing up and more people filling the streets. They caused quite a stir when they rode in, the rough mountain man and his well-dressed wife with a baby strapped to her chest. Victoria saw people pointing and whispering, clearly remembering the scandal of the abandoned bride who had married a stranger and disappeared into the mountains. They ran into Mrs. Fletcher on the main street, the boarding house owner looking shocked to see Victoria. "Miss Owens," she exclaimed, then caught herself. "Or I suppose it is Mrs. Owens now. I heard you had married, but I had no idea what had become of you. And a baby. Mrs. Fletcher, allow me to introduce my husband, Dalton Owens, and our son, James." Victoria could not keep the pride from her voice. "Mrs." Fletcher looked between them, clearly trying to piece together the story. "You married the mountain man who came looking for Pritchard. I remember now. Everyone thought you were mad, running off into the wilderness with a stranger." "Best decision I ever made," Victoria said firmly, reaching out to take Dalton's hand. He squeezed her fingers, his expression softening as he looked at her. "Well, you certainly look happy and healthy," Mrs. Fletcher said, her skepticism fading into genuine warmth. "I am glad things worked out for you, dear. Lord knows you deserved some good fortune after your troubles." They spent 2 days in Prescott purchasing supplies and allowing Victoria to reconnect with the few acquaintances she had made during her brief time in town. Sarah Mitchell, the woman who had suggested she work at the saloon, was particularly delighted to see her, exclaiming over baby James and begging for all the details of her romantic story. "It is like something out of a novel," Sarah said as they shared tea in her parlor. "The abandoned bride and the mysterious mountain man who swept her away to his cabin. You must be the envy of every unmarried woman in the territory." "I am just grateful," Victoria said honestly. "I thought my life was over when I discovered Mr. Pritchard had died. Instead, it was only beginning." On their last evening in town, they ate dinner at a restaurant, a rare treat after months of home cooking. As they sat there, James sleeping peacefully in Victoria's arms and Dalton's hand warm on her knee beneath the table, Victoria reflected on the incredible journey that had brought them to this moment. "What are you thinking?" Dalton asked, reading her expression. "I am thinking about how far we have come. A year ago, I was standing on that train platform, completely alone and terrified, and now I have everything I could ever want. You, James, our home in the mountains, it seems impossible." "Not impossible," Dalton said, his steel-gray eyes warm with love. "Just unexpected. The best things usually are." They rode back to their mountain home the next morning, eager to return to the peace and privacy of their valley. James was fussing from the journey, but he settled as soon as they crossed into familiar territory, as if even at his young age he could sense that he was home. The years that followed were full and happy. James grew into a sturdy, adventurous boy with his father's steel-gray eyes and his mother's quick smile. When he was 3, Victoria gave birth to a daughter they named Emma, a tiny, fierce creature who had Dalton wrapped around her little finger from the moment she drew breath. 2 years later came another son, Daniel, who was quieter than his older brother, but just as strong. Dalton expanded the cabin, adding rooms to accommodate their growing family. He also improved the barn and fences, gradually transforming their mountain homestead from a trapper's camp into a proper ranch. They acquired cattle and chickens, expanding their livestock beyond the horses. Victoria planted a larger garden and learned to preserve enough food to feed their family through the long winters. Life was not without its challenges. There were harsh winters that tested their endurance, summers when drought threatened their water supply, illnesses and injuries that frightened them both. But they faced everything together, their love and partnership growing stronger with each obstacle they overcame. They made the journey to Prescott once a year, partly for supplies, but mostly to maintain some connection to civilization for the children's sake. The town continued to grow, and they watched with interest as the Arizona Territory slowly transformed from wild frontier to settled land. But they had no desire to leave their mountain home, to trade the peace and freedom of their valley for the convenience of town life. When James was 10, he asked his mother about her journey west, about how she and his father had met. Victoria told him the story about answering the advertisement, about arriving to find her intended husband dead, about the night his father had walked into the saloon looking for a debt and found something far more valuable. "So Papa traveled 200 miles to collect money, but instead he found you?" James asked, trying to understand. "That is right," Victoria said, smiling at the memory. "He traveled all that way for something that seemed important, only to discover that what was really important was something he had never expected to find." "Do you think things happen for a reason?" James asked with a child's earnest curiosity. "That you were supposed to meet Papa?" Victoria thought about that, about the series of unlikely events that had led her to this life. Harold Pritchard's death, Dalton's quest for payment, her desperate circumstances, the instant connection between them. It seemed impossible that it was all just random chance. I think we make choices," she said carefully, "and those choices lead us to where we need to be. I chose to come west. Your father chose to seek his debt. And when we met, we both chose to take a chance on each other. Maybe that is what fate really is, just a series of brave choices that lead you home." That evening, after the children were asleep, Victoria stood outside the cabin, looking up at the stars wheeling overhead in their eternal dance. She felt Dalton come up behind her, his arms wrapping around her waist, his chin resting on the top of her head. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked quietly. "Giving up civilization, living this hard life?" "Never," Victoria said without hesitation. "This is not the life I planned, Dalton. It is so much better than anything I could have imagined. You gave me a home, a family, a purpose. You gave me love. How could I possibly regret that?" "I love you," Dalton murmured against her hair. "Every day for the rest of my life, I will be grateful that I walked into that saloon and found you." "I love you too," Victoria said, turning in his arms to kiss him. "My mountain man, my husband, my everything." The years continued to pass, each one building on the last, creating a life of richness and meaning. Their children grew strong and capable, learning to thrive in the wilderness while also receiving education from the books Victoria and Dalton carefully accumulated. They learned to read and write, to do mathematics, to appreciate poetry and literature. They also learned to hunt and trap, to track animals, to read the weather and survive in harsh conditions. When James turned 18, he announced his intention to head to Prescott to seek his own fortune, perhaps to apprentice with a carpenter or blacksmith. It was hard for Victoria to let him go, her firstborn heading out into the world, but she understood the need. Dalton had left his own family at a similar age, seeking his own path. It was the natural order of things. Emma, at 15, declared that she had no intention of ever leaving the mountains, that she would build her own cabin nearby when she was old enough and live as her parents did. Daniel, at 13, was still figuring out what he wanted, but he seemed drawn to the idea of ranching, of building on what his father had started. One evening in the fall of 1897, 15 years after that fateful meeting in Prescott, Victoria and Dalton sat on the porch of their expanded cabin, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. Their life together was approaching middle age, gray threading through Dalton's dark hair and laugh lines creasing Victoria's face. But the love between them burned as brightly as ever, deepened by years of partnership and shared experiences. "Do you remember that first night we spent in the cave?" Dalton asked, his fingers laced with Victoria's. "During that terrible storm." "I remember," Victoria said with a soft smile. "I was so frightened of the lightning, and you held me and told me I was safe." "That was the night I knew I had made the right decision," Dalton said. "The night I knew you were not just a practical solution to loneliness, but something far more important. The night I started to fall in love with you." "I fell in love with you that night too," Victoria admitted. "Or maybe I started falling in love with you the moment you called me brave. No one had ever seen me that way before. You looked at me and saw strength instead of desperation." "Because you are strong," Dalton said, turning to look at her with those steel-gray eyes that still made her heart skip. "You were strong enough to travel across a country for a dream, strong enough to survive when that dream died, strong enough to take a chance on a rough mountain man and build a life in the wilderness, strong enough to raise 3 incredible children and create a home filled with love. You are the strongest person I know, Victoria." "We are strong together," Victoria corrected, squeezing his hand. "That is what makes this work. We are partners in everything, Dalton. We always have been." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Victoria reflected on the unlikely path that had brought her to this moment. She had been a bride no one came to claim, abandoned and alone in a frontier town with no prospects and no future. And then Dalton had appeared, a mountain man who had traveled 200 miles for a debt and found instead a wife, a family, a life worth far more than any amount of money. Their love story was not the conventional romance Victoria had read about in novels during her youth. There had been no long courtship, no gradual building of affection through shared experiences and careful consideration. Instead, they had made a leap of faith, trusting in an instant connection and the courage to take a chance. It should not have worked. It was impractical and impulsive and went against every sensible piece of advice Victoria had ever received. But it had worked, beautifully and completely. Because sometimes love was not about logic or practicality. Sometimes it was about recognizing the person you were meant to be with and being brave enough to claim them, even when it made no sense. Dalton had been brave enough to propose marriage to a woman he barely knew. Victoria had been brave enough to say yes, and that mutual bravery had created something extraordinary. "What are you thinking about?" Dalton asked, reading her contemplative expression. "I'm thinking about bravery," Victoria said, "and how the bravest thing I ever did was say yes when you asked me to marry you." "The bravest thing I ever did was ask," Dalton replied with a smile. "I was terrified you would say no, or that you would say yes and then regret it." "Never," Victoria said firmly. "Not for a single moment have I regretted choosing you, choosing this life. Even in the hardest times, even when the winters were brutal and the work was backbreaking, even when I was exhausted from caring for babies or worried about one of the children being sick. Through all of it, I have been grateful, because I was not facing it alone. I was facing it with you." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, hands still clasped, watching as the full moon rose over the mountains. Inside the cabin, they could hear the murmur of their children's voices as Emma and Daniel prepared for bed. It was an ordinary evening, one of thousands they had shared over their 15 years together. But Victoria had learned that these ordinary moments were actually the most precious, the building blocks of a life well lived. "I have been thinking," Dalton said after a while, "about building another cabin, for when the children start having families of their own, creating a small settlement here in our valley so they can be close even when they are grown." "A family compound," Victoria said, warming to the idea, "so our grandchildren can grow up knowing each other, so we can all help each other through hard times." "Exactly. We have something good here, Victoria, something worth preserving and sharing. I want our children and grandchildren to have the same opportunities we had to build lives of meaning and purpose." "I think that is a wonderful idea," Victoria said. "We have carved out something special here. We should protect it, nurture it, help it grow." They talked late into the night about their plans, about the legacy they wanted to leave. When they finally went to bed, Victoria curled into Dalton's solid warmth with a sense of contentment so complete it was almost overwhelming. This was what she had been searching for all those years ago when she answered Harold Pritchard's advertisement. Not wealth or status or even security, though those things mattered. What she had truly been seeking was this feeling of belonging, of being cherished, of building something meaningful with someone who saw and valued her true self. She had found it in the most unlikely way, through tragedy and chance and a mountain man's quest for payment. But she had found it nonetheless, and she would spend the rest of her life grateful for that incredible stroke of fortune. As the years continued to pass, their life took on a rhythm as predictable and comforting as the changing seasons. James did indeed move to Prescott, where he apprenticed with a carpenter and eventually opened his own business. But he came home to visit several times a year, often bringing gifts and news from the wider world. Emma remained true to her word, building a small cabin a half-mile from her parents' home when she turned 20, living independently but close enough to remain part of the family unit. Daniel took over more and more of the ranching duties as Dalton aged, showing a real talent for animal husbandry and land management. When Victoria was 45 and Dalton 57, they became grandparents for the first time. James had married a young woman named Sarah from Prescott, and they brought their newborn son to meet his mountain-dwelling grandparents. Victoria held little Thomas with tears streaming down her face, marveling at the continuation of the family she and Dalton had created. "He has your eyes," she told Dalton, who was hovering anxiously, clearly eager for his turn to hold his grandson. "And your smile," Dalton said, finally taking the baby into his large, weathered hands with the same infinite gentleness he had shown when holding his own children. "Welcome to the world, Thomas. Welcome to the family." More grandchildren followed over the years. Emma married a young trapper who had wandered into their valley and fell in love with both the land and Dalton's fierce daughter. They had 3 children in quick succession, filling the valley with the sounds of young voices and laughter. Daniel married later, choosing a schoolteacher from Prescott who was willing to embrace the mountain lifestyle. Their 2 children were born strong and healthy, adding to the growing Owens clan. The family compound Dalton had envisioned became a reality, with multiple cabins scattered throughout the valley, each family maintaining their independence while remaining close enough to help each other. They gathered for meals on Sundays, celebrated holidays together, and supported each other through the inevitable challenges of frontier life. Victoria found her role evolving as she aged. She was no longer the young bride struggling to learn wilderness survival, but rather the matriarch of a thriving family, the grandmother who told stories and taught the youngest generation to read. She still worked hard, maintaining her garden and helping with the endless tasks required to sustain their community, but she also had time to appreciate the life she and Dalton had built. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Dalton surprised her with a gift he had been working on in secret. It was a beautiful wooden box intricately carved with images of their life together. The mountains, the cabin, figures representing their children, even a tiny carved train to represent Victoria's journey west. "I wanted you to have something that showed our story," Dalton said as Victoria ran her fingers over the detailed carvings, tears blurring her vision. "Something you could pass down to our grandchildren so they would know where they came from." "It is beautiful," Victoria breathed. "The most beautiful thing I have ever seen. Thank you, Dalton. Thank you for this, for our life, for everything." "Thank you," Dalton said, cupping her face in his large hands. "Thank you for being brave enough to say yes to a crazy mountain man. Thank you for building this life with me. Thank you for 20 years of love and partnership. You are still the most beautiful thing I have ever seen, Victoria Owens. You always will be." They made love that night with the passion and tenderness of longtime partners who knew every inch of each other's bodies and hearts. Afterward, lying in the darkness, Victoria thought about how far they had come from that first awkward night in the hotel when they were strangers bound by legal papers but not yet by love. Now they were so intertwined, so completely part of each other, that Victoria could not imagine existing without Dalton by her side. The years continued their inexorable march. Victoria's hair turned silver, and Dalton's powerful frame finally began to show the effects of decades of hard living. But their love never diminished, never faded. If anything, it grew stronger, deeper, more essential with each passing year. When Victoria was 62 and Dalton 74, they sat together on the same porch where they had spent countless evenings, watching the sunset paint the mountains in familiar shades of gold and purple. Their hands were clasped as always, fingers intertwined in a gesture that had become as natural as breathing. "Do you remember the first time we watched a sunset together?" Victoria asked. "On the journey from Prescott to the cabin?" "I remember," Dalton said, his voice still deep despite his age. "You asked me if I was lonely. I told you I had been, but that I was not anymore." "And you never were again," Victoria said softly. "We filled each other's loneliness, Dalton. We created something beautiful together." "The most beautiful thing," Dalton agreed. He was quiet for a moment, then continued in a more serious tone. "Victoria, I need to tell you something. I am 74 years old. I have lived a long, hard life, and I have been blessed with 40 incredible years with you. But I know my time is getting shorter. My body is wearing out, and while my mind is still sharp, I can feel myself slowing down." Victoria felt her throat tighten with emotion, but she forced herself to listen. "When my time comes," Dalton continued, "I want you to know that I have no regrets, none. You gave me everything I could have ever wanted and so much more than I deserved. You turned my lonely mountain existence into a life filled with love and family and meaning. Whatever happens, I want you to remember that." "Stop talking like that," Victoria said, her voice breaking. "You are not going anywhere. We still have years ahead of us." "Maybe," Dalton said gently, "and if we do, I will cherish every moment. But I wanted to say this while I still can, while my mind is clear. I love you, Victoria Owens. I loved you from the moment I saw you in that saloon, and I will love you until I draw my last breath. And if there is anything beyond this life, I will love you there too." Victoria was crying now, unable to hold back the tears. "I love you too. I love you so much it hurts. You saved me, Dalton. You gave me a life worth living." "We saved each other," Dalton corrected, pulling her close. "That is what love does. It saves us from loneliness, from meaninglessness, from all the things that make life hard to bear. We were both lost until we found each other." They sat like that for a long time, holding each other as the stars emerged one by one in the darkening sky. Inside the cabin, they could hear the sounds of their family, grandchildren playing while their parents prepared dinner. It was the sound of life, of continuity, of the legacy Victoria and Dalton had created together. Dalton lived another 8 years, staying active and engaged until the very end. He died peacefully in his sleep at the age of 82, with Victoria holding his hand and their children and grandchildren gathered around his bed. His last words were, "I love you," spoken to Victoria with his final breath. Victoria grieved deeply, feeling as though a part of herself had been torn away. But she was surrounded by love, by the family she and Dalton had created, and they carried her through the dark days. She remained in the cabin they had shared, tending her garden and telling stories to her great-grandchildren about the mountain man who had traveled 200 miles for a debt and found something far more precious. She lived another 12 years, dying at the age of 82, the same age Dalton had been. Her children laid her to rest beside him on a hillside overlooking their valley, with a simple stone marker that read, "Victoria Owens, beloved wife and mother. She was brave enough to take a chance on love." Their story became legend in the family, passed down through generations. The tale of the bride no one came to claim, and the mountain man who traveled 200 miles and found her. The story of how two lonely people took a chance on each other and built something extraordinary. The story of a love that transcended logic and practicality, that was rooted instead in courage and connection and the willingness to believe that sometimes the best things in life are the ones you never planned. The Owens family continued to thrive in their mountain valley, each generation adding to the legacy Victoria and Dalton had begun. The original cabin was preserved as a family shrine, filled with mementos of that first generation. The carved wooden box Dalton had made, the simple gold wedding band Victoria had worn, letters and photographs and small treasures that told the story of a remarkable love. And on summer evenings, When the grandchildren and great-grandchildren gathered for family dinners, someone would inevitably ask to hear the story again. The story of how great-grandmother Victoria came west to marry a stranger who died before she arrived. How she worked in a saloon and thought her life was over. How great-grandfather Dalton rode into town seeking payment for a debt and found instead a woman with brave eyes and a determined spirit. How they married after knowing each other for less than a day and rode off into the mountains together. How they built a life and a family and a love that lasted 48 years and continued to resonate long after they were gone. It was a story about bravery and chance, about recognizing the person you were meant to be with and having the courage to claim them. It was a story about how the worst circumstances can lead to the best outcomes if you are willing to keep hoping, keep trying, keep taking risks. It was a story about love in its truest, deepest form, the kind of love that transforms lives and creates legacies. And it all started with a woman standing alone on a train platform in Prescott, Arizona, and a mountain man who traveled 200 miles to collect a debt. Two people who should never have met, whose paths should never have crossed, but who found each other anyway, who recognized something essential in each other and were brave enough to act on it, who built a life together that became the foundation for generations to come. Their story was one of heartache transformed into joy, of desperation redeemed by love, of two lonely souls finding home in each other. It was a testament to the power of human connection, to the courage required to trust and be vulnerable, to the rewards that come from taking chances even when the outcome is uncertain. Victoria and Dalton's love story became more than just family history. It became a reminder that life rarely goes according to plan, but that sometimes the detours and disasters lead to destinations far better than anything we originally envisioned. That being abandoned and alone does not mean being defeated. That traveling 200 miles for something and finding nothing does not mean the journey was wasted. That sometimes what we think we need and what we actually need are two completely different things. They had both been searching for something when they met that day in Prescott. Dalton had been searching for payment, for justice, for the money he needed to survive another winter. Victoria had been searching for security, for belonging, for someone to tell her she mattered. Neither found what they were looking for. They found something better. They found each other. They found love. And in the end, that made all the difference.